The topic for this session is the United States and the great powers, China and Russia. Of course, in traditional international relations theory, as you all know, the great powers are at center stage. Perspectives on globalization, of economics, and even the globalization of ideology tends to modify that particular conception of the so-called great powers. Mr. Fingar will address the questions of the great powers in general and will speak specifically about our policies toward both China and Russia. Dr. Thomas Fingar is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis in the Department, or rather the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. His extraordinary responsibilities are supervision of analysis for all the countries and regions, for transnational issues such as trade, refugees, arms transfers, weapons of mass destruction. His PhD and his MA and PhD are both from Stanford University in political science. He's a career member of the Senior Executive Service. He's the author of a dozen books, one of which is China's Quest for Independence. From 1975 to 1986, he held positions at Stanford as a senior research associate, was at the National Academy of Sciences. He was an advisor in the Office of Technology Assessment and a consultant to numerous government and private groups. From 1986 to 1989, he was chief of the China Division within the Office of Analysis for East Asia and the Pacific. And from 89 to 94, he was then director of the Office of Analysis for East Asia and the Pacific, before assuming his present position as Assistant Secretary for Analysis in INR. Now, we're fortunate to be joined by someone who's at the very center of the questions of policy analysis within the Department of State. It's my great pleasure to present Dr. Thomas Fingar.
Good afternoon. I must begin in Japanese fashion with an apology that I have a terrible cold and am getting over a case of laryngitis which precluded any speech whatsoever just 2 days ago. So please bear with me if I'm not as exciting, dynamic, stimulating. I'm settling for having you hear me. The second introductory remark will be what I would like to do today is to address you as Tom Fingar, who happens to work in the State Department. With the views I am going to express are not necessarily those of the department, rather than speak to you as a bureaucrat, and the views of which I'm about to express are not necessarily my own. It's much, I think, easier for me as an analyst to address questions as objectively as one can without always running it through the lens of American policy preferences. When it comes time for questions, if you want to know what U.S. policy is, I would be happy to give you my best interpretation of what our policy is. But I'm going to be speaking to you as an individual. If you hear me say something that sounds like it is not consistent with what you understand our policy to be, I've probably got it wrong. And don't hesitate to ask. Finally, by way of introductory remarks, I want to congratulate the organizers of this program. I think it's fantastic. Having done speaking in town meetings and so forth all around the country, this, in my experience, is unique, and it is important, and I commend you, and I'm delighted to be here. Our public doesn't know as much about foreign affairs as any of us who are self-styled professionals would like to be the case. But it's my observation that the American people know a lot more and care a lot more about international affairs than they're given credit for. by the pundits, by the media, and too often by members of the government, executive and legislative branch. There's a lot of understanding out there. There's also a lot of uncertainty. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations regularly polls the public, and it's become one of the baselines for gauging changes in attitude. And I want to pick up on Dr. Biocco's closing observations in part. Resources for international affairs. It's terribly underfunded. When asked, the American public reacts as a group, we spend too much on international affairs. How much should we spend? 6% of the budget should go to foreign affairs. How much do you think we spend? 13% of the budget. How much do you think we spend? Less than 1%. That's right, I heard it over here. Less than 1%. To be represented in 185 countries. To deal with the problems of, on any given day, roughly 4 million Americans who are outside of our borders. That's bigger than a lot of states, all of whom are the responsibility of the Secretary of State unless they are in uniform and under a sink. We attempt to do too much on a shoestring in foreign affairs and through diplomacy, which is one of the reasons that too many tasks get shifted to the military. And we've got a tool designed for one purpose being applied in others. One of the areas, though, in which the American public does have a pretty good handle on international affairs is the uncertainty of the world. The same poll, last asked in 1998, asked what are the biggest threats to the United States? And the winner, overwhelmingly, 21%, was I don't know. And I say that not to slight people, but because the world is remarkably peaceful for Americans. There's tremendous turmoil, 25 million displaced and refugees, conflicts in Africa from the Red Sea all the way down through Angola, economic dislocation and poverty, as was pointed out by one of the questioners. Most of it doesn't affect us very directly. So a list that can have proliferation, terrorism, Russia, China, Libya, Iraq, Iran, disease, poverty, environmental problems, they're on the agenda. They're on the consciousness of American people. We are so fortunate, so powerful, and so prosperous. That must be the starting point for the discussion. Indeed, in a sense, we live in a world that the United States made, not by ourselves, by any stretch of the imagination, but the institutions, IMF and World Bank, were discussed a few moments ago, were deliberate creations coming out of World War II. The Cold War institutions, the outcome of the Cold War, does have a certain made in America quality. There is much of the world that regards the term globalization as a euphemism for Americanization. This makes us a status quo power par excellence. We benefit very much from the existing world order. Now, I think stating that is to overstate it. The way in which we perceive ourselves is to exaggerate our own importance. I have problems with the idea of an indispensable nation. And yet, there's a reality to it. And there's another layer of perceived reality. Much of the world sees us in this capacity. This makes us arrogant, no question. That in the 80-odd countries I've been to, we have a few equals and no champions in the arrogance category. We are right up there with the French and the Chinese and others who think of themselves as unbelievably important. This shouldn't make us complacent. It certainly makes us a target. Target not just for terrorism as the instrument of the weak against the strong. It makes us a target of envy. It makes us the target of those wishing for help and handouts, assistance. There's much criticism of the global sheriff. There's also much desire for American help in maintaining stability. What it should make us is confident. Confident in our ability to operate in a world that we have played a large part in making and that works largely to our benefit. The question becomes one of how best to prolong our moment in the sun, how best to use this historic opportunity. In all of history, and once upon a time I was a historian, one has to look very hard to find comparable examples of one nation so towering over the world, the whole world, even a regional. How do we use it? There are two basic schools of thought in this country. One is you preserve it by undermining any challenger. Cut down any rival or potential rival before they can topple us from the king of the hill position. There's a lot of emphasis on military force, on using economic power in the form of sanctions. We're here and you're not going to be, kind of approach. The other asks, how can this power, this preeminence, be used to transform the world? To co-opt the potential rivals, give them a stake in the world by sharing some of what we've got. Now, these are ideal types. There's obviously positions in between. But they exist. And if you listen to speeches of members of Congress and read the op-ed pages, I think you can begin to assign people to one or another of those broad schools. Because there is no resolution, probably shouldn't be a clear resolution, we approach the world and we approach the major powers with a certain mixture of ambivalence and schizophrenia. Ambivalent, we don't know. Are they our friends? Are they potential rivals? Are they still adversaries? Are they working with us toward our goals, or are they working to undermine our preeminent status? Friend or foe? Well, we behave towards much of the world, certainly toward Russia and China, as if they were a mixture of the two. That Dr. Bioglo mentioned the need for wrestling with imperfect options, flawed policy decisions, and compromises. It's absolutely the case. And yet performance is usually evaluated against absolutist goals. Did you achieve human rights, religion, non-proliferation, market access, and any of 50 other, clean up the environment, as if it were the only goal being pursued? Real world doesn't allow it. So you add in the uncertainties, the complexities of dealing on any given day, not with one issue at a time, but dealing with a major country, 20 issues at a time, maybe 30 issues at a time, weaving them together, decide where do I spend my political, diplomatic, military, economic capital today? At what downstream cost? How can it help me to maximize 3 or 4 goals if I pursue it in this sequence? It looks kind of messy. Overlay that with the ambivalence and schizophrenia, and I think it becomes clear why there is confusion, uncertainty, even unhappiness about the way in which the United States deals with Russia and China, the two major powers, the other two major powers. Part of this is baggage and legacy of Cold War. Part of it is the arguable need to have some kind of an enemy. If we didn't have an enemy or a potential enemy, why do we spend a third of the budget on our military? Why do we spend as much as the next 19 nations combined, all of whom are our allies, if there aren't any enemies? Well, we don't want to invent enemies, and yet there is an uncertainty. This isn't silly, it's prudent to take these kinds of defensive measures. Well, what's at stake in dealing with Russia and China? I sometimes take a rather simplistic view of the world. It helps me to cope with the array of bouncing from Kosovo to Congo to Korea, terrorism to refugees to environmental kinds of issues, usually in the same hour. You've got to get the big ones right. That the uncertainty about what the threats are and the myriad of interests and issues that we have as a nation are not all equal. They may all have a certain kind of single issue constituency behind them, but they're not all the same. There are some, as an animal farm, some animals are more equal than others. Russia and China are more equal than others. These are big countries. Almost 200 million for Russia, 1.3 billion for China. Big in land mass, more or less comparable to our own country. Big economies, although most of the Russian economy is invisible. Doesn't show up in the statistics. I mean, among the kind of things those who play with the world look at and say, that's bizarre, that the total budget of Russia is smaller than what the United States spends on the intelligence community. There's probably something wrong with the budget numbers. There's a lot that aren't being captured, but it's a big economy. It's a big science and engineering establishment. The human talent that exists in these countries to be tapped for medical research, to deal with environmental problems, or to make weapons or scheme to undercut us, depending on how it is organized and motivated. There's an obvious point, and many of you are probably wondering why it's taking us so long to get there. These countries have nuclear weapons and the capacity to deliver them right here, right now. A wag in Germany, looking at the Russian economy, asked why in the world one would pay so much attention to Russia. Russia was like Burkina Faso in the poor countries in Africa. And response from the German foreign minister was, correction, Burkina Faso with nukes. It makes a difference. Psychologically, it makes a difference in just how arrogantly we might strut our stuff, how far one can push, what one must anticipate in terms of national pride, what one must reconcile with in terms of their security concerns. Why do they have these weapons? Perhaps they don't yet buy fully the argument that we are as benign, as well-meaning, as generous as we think of ourselves. Get into the heads of the other guy. They have security concerns too, and during the period of the Cold War, this gave us a basis for a lot of conversations. We talked to the Soviets a lot about control of weapons. We had a shared interest in avoiding a nuclear exchange. Very pragmatic interest, which taught us a lot about one another. Another obvious point. Russia and China sit on the Security Council of the United Nations. Permanent members have a veto. To the extent that the United States wishes or finds it convenient finds it useful to operate on the world stage using the United Nations, as in Bosnia, as in the Gulf War. Those vetoes can stop us. The United Nations is very important to Russia and China because it is one of the arenas in which they're an equal. They're an absolute equal of the United States. Same veto capability. Perhaps not so obvious is these countries have influence with many others. Some, it is influence for reasons of historical legacy. Some it is sort of shared ideology, shared objectives. But at one level, what they have in common with others is an element of concern about the hegemon, the big guy on the block, the United States. There is a sort of anybody that can organize the Lilliputians to tie down Gulliver might have some leadership potential, and China and Russia both have that potential. Others look to Russia and China to manage us. A fuller discussion, more time, I would put Europe and Japan on almost the same tier of the you have to get it right as I do Russia and China. In many ways, they are more important to us short term. But staying focused on the two big guys. What's the challenge? That's the way I think we have to view this. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, it's to incorporate them into the international system. Integrate them fully into the international system. Remember one of my starting observations. This is our system. And in stating it, exaggerates it. But bringing them into the world order with shared dependencies, shared stake, the constraining as well as the empowering effects of trade, of military transparency, of exchanges of ideas and people. Both of these countries are so big, so complex, in their own way so wealthy, so powerful, that if they're not brought in to be a part of the solution, there is no solution to any meaningful international problem. And they are part of almost every international problem, just as we are a part of almost every significant international problem, even if it's only as the object or the target of the activity. What's at stake? Well, think of the three instances in the last century where we didn't get it right. Rising powers that were not brought into the international system. Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. World Wars I and II, and the Cold War. Cold War cost us trillions of dollars and stunted development many places, including here. That's the kind of stakes that we face in dealing with Russia and China. This is one we have to get right, or have to get it basically right, or have to get it mostly right most of the time. I'm an optimist. I think we're getting it right mostly, most of the time, and that we will get it right, because it doesn't require that we be exceedingly smart. It simply requires that we avoid being exceedingly stupid. And we're up to that challenge. Even we lazy bureaucrats inside the Beltway. Part of dealing with Russia and China is reducing problems and threats, or the magnitude, alleviating the problems. They are nuclear powers. We engage in arms reduction talks. We're eager to move to start 3 deeper cuts in those nuclear arsenals. Ours and the Russians. The Chinese are not yet ready to come into those talks. They say build down. You get down to our level, and then we'll talk about cutting too. But the tremendous reduction in the number of warheads that has been achieved, the detargeting of missiles. Yes, they can be retargeted pretty quickly, but they're not on hair trigger alert, and the danger of accidental launch is greatly reduced. For those of us who grew up hiding under the bleachers in practice for a nuclear attack, this is a big deal, that the world is safer. In retrospect, it's hard to believe we were so silly in the 50s when we thought a bleacher would protect us from fallout, but I guess the alternative was to build fallout shelters, and that would have been too expensive, so we pretended. Economic opportunities, trade opportunities for our companies, to be sure, but economic activity to promote development. We live exceedingly well, in part, I would argue in large part, because we are the #1 exemplar of free trade, open markets, being able to take advantage of international division of labor, economies of scale, others competing to be in this market. Experience suggests that it's not simply American arrogance of transferring our way of doing things to others, but that building up the economies of Russia and China is in their interest and in our interest. And if you want a real-world example or two, look at Europe, Marshall Plan. Europe is our most serious economic competitor and our strongest ally. Japan, major competitor, built up in large part with access to American markets and technology. A very firm ally, which has done something one would regard in international relations theory as almost incomprehensible, entrusted its fundamental security to another country, moving under our nuclear umbrella and staying there for 50 years. A country that large, that advanced technologically with its history, pretty impressive. Dealing with outbreaks of disease, dealing with refugee flows, dealing with violence around the world. Far better if we can work with Russians and Chinese than not have them be a part of the solution. We certainly would not want to go back to the time up until the 1980s when the Chinese were promoting wars of national liberation, Southeast Asia and in Africa. Certainly wouldn't want to go back to the days when we and the Soviet Union lined up with different sides in Africa. And for those of us with gray hair, and remember the history living on in the Congo today, the ruler of Congo-Kinshasa, Mr. Kabila was an associate of Patrice Lumumba. Those of you remember in 1960 in the role of the CIA, and we, in our rivalry with the Soviet Union, this is the last vestige of that manifestation. Nobody wants to go back to that era, and we don't need to. And finally, and one of the main reasons that I want to step out of the State Department official role here is to be able to admit what is hard to state in official, and that's transform them. That we do have an interest in transforming these systems, locking in the democratic change in Russia, locking in the shift to a market economy, locking in the greater religious freedom, the freedom of migration, and so forth. In China, I started China 35 years ago, the Cultural Revolution, massive, massive violations of human rights, very disruptive on the international scene. 2.5 decades of engagement with the United States, China is a very different place and a very much better place. But one of the most difficult aspects of selling China policy, it's less of a problem with Russia policy, is what would sell most easily in the United States audiences We're changing this place. We're making it over in ways that are better and better for us. To say that to a Chinese audience, they naturally dig in. Political system doesn't want to be changed in certain ways, wants to be modern, doesn't want to be Western, wants economic change, isn't so thrilled with political change. It would be much easier to march up to the hill and saying the purpose of our policy is to effect change, and we're doing it. And I could make a long list for you of the ways in which China has changed. One can make a similar list for Russia in the last 10 years. It works. Engagement works. And yet, if one looks at specific aspects of policy, this dissident, that factory, that missile sale, exports of technology, espionage, involvement in campaign finances, maybe. All these problems. Looks like the policy failed. And yet step back. Think of how Russia looked a decade ago. Think how China looked a decade ago or 2 decades ago. They've both changed tremendously. Interaction with them has changed us as well, but not nearly as much. I don't feel sort of less liberal, less democratic, less capitalist for dealing with these folks because they have still remnants of a socialist economy, a Marxist ideology in China. That's the reason I think we should be confident. There is nothing so corrosive in the world as exposure to Americans. When we do what we do in business, in classrooms, in people to people, occasionally in diplomacy, military to military relations, by being who we are and doing things the way we do, we are a pretty powerful example. By refusing, because it's against the law, to give bribes, to pick one example. It's a different way of doing business, cheaper way of doing business. It begins to catch on officials that are mostly honest most of the time. Putting foreign managers in place of joint ventures rather than relying on expats, and on and on and on. We're very, very effective simply by being in contact. And sometimes it's the dog that doesn't bark that underscores the point. The examples where we have attempted to engineer change by isolation, by refusing to deal. North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Libya. Now maybe the sanctions against Castro will kick in and work one of these days. Maybe 38 years just isn't long enough. But by engaging with Taiwan, with South Korea, Thailand, now Indonesia, now Central Europe, once upon a time authoritarian one-party statist systems have changed dramatically to the betterment of their people, to the benefit of the world, and to the benefit of all who think stability is a good virtue. I could give you a list of issues and policies for each country. I suspect you have one as well. What about Taiwan? What about cross straits? What about missile sales? What about dealings between Russia and Iran? What about Russia and Kosovo? NATO expansion, da-da-da. Rather than pick some of those out, I want to stop here and throw it open to questions, but throw it open to questions that allow me to have fun and you to perhaps take advantage of the fact that I'm one of, I guess, 4 in the department that actually pretends to do the whole world. I know more about some issues than others. I suggest, though, if you have economic questions, you hold them for Brian Samuel, who really does know a lot more about that than I do. And throw it open dealing with the great powers, and I consider that not show-off, but legitimate, because dealing with our ability to deal with all other countries is in some ways affected by the efficacy, the success, the credibility of the way in which we deal with the two major powers. When we are perceived as screwing up relations with one or the other or both, our allies get very nervous. National missile defense, case in point. Asians that have benefited over a period of prosperity that exactly coincides with the periods of normalization of U.S.-China relations, which in my old communist studies days we would have said is no coincidence, comrade. And others understand that. So I consider it very legitimate to throw this open to anything you want to ask me.
Well, we thank you for what I think was an extraordinarily interesting analysis. The floor is now open for questions. Yes, sir. The question is, why was Russia kept out of the solution, the post-war solution in Kosovo?
The short answer is it wasn't. That having Russian troops participate in KFOR was an objective and an attained objective. They knew they were going to be in. The argument was whether or not they would have their own zone. As there's a French zone, there's an American zone, British zone, and so forth. And while that was being debated, the Russian troops got in their vehicles and raced down to Pristina, to the airfield. I think it was a deliberate and calculated political move. And so you've got to deal with us seriously. It's one of these examples. I was in the office when it happened. It was a Friday night, if I remember correctly, late. And there was what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I said, does the concept of a donut mean anything to you? They're now in Pristina. They're totally surrounded. They have no way to be resupplied. What's the rush? But having been, in a more serious note here, elbowed aside in the diplomatic talks, in the view of Russians, and I believe to include Mr. Yeltsin, having been taken for granted, the Russians will want to be a part of this. They'll go along with anything that we concoct. They want to be there to protect their fellow Slavs, the Serbs' traditional ties. They want to be there to show they're a major power. They can be in the field with NATO. A little bit of sense of being taken for granted, and they wanted to make it clear that they weren't going to be taken for granted. Happily, it was a very benign way to send that message.
The question is, what is the role of the U.S. in preserving the peace between the two Chinas? That biases the question a little bit, as opposed to a one-China policy, but the question was two Chinas.
I'm going to skate on this one a little bit, but I want to take a running start at it because it's a very good question. The election on Taiwan is a terribly important development. Let me take you back in history. In 1971, when Henry Kissinger made his secret trip to China, 72 Shanghai Communique, beginnings of assurances of one China. We recognized the government in Taipei, the Republic of China, which claimed to be the government of all China. Government in Beijing claimed to be the government of all China. There was no significant difference. Chinese on both sides of the strait said there's one China. We said Chinese on both sides of the strait say there's one China. We acknowledged that they say that. That was our position. At that time, both were ruled by single-party regimes, Leninist regimes. The Kuomintang was founded by the Comintern. A closed society, martial law. I am not suggesting equivalence. I lived in Taiwan under martial law. It was a whole lot better than living in the mainland under the Cultural Revolution would have been. But on the grand scheme of state possibilities, there was not a lot to distinguish. Big state sector, party dominance. That remained the case until about 1987, 88, when Taiwan began to change dramatically, allowing formation of other parties, opening up in many, many ways, ultimately lifting martial law, the direct election of the president that occurred last month, and the overthrow of the ruling government that had been in power for 51 years, so it is. A remarkable development. It's now no longer clearly the case that Chinese on both sides of the strait say there's one China, or there's one cultural China, but not yet one political China. That the concept has become slipperier, different. The world has changed. The U.S. official policy is one China. Chinese official policy is whatever the resolution of this. Doesn't have to be unification. They can decide to have independence. They can decide some middle ground. Up to Chinese both sides of the strait. Just should be peaceful. So the role of the United States in this is a complicated mix of historical legacy. We did have a security treaty with the Republic of China until 1980. A year after normalization, it expired. We have, under the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed at the time of normalization, an obligation to maintain military balance in the strait, matter of American law, providing necessary armament to Taiwan. Beijing sees this as encouraging independence. Sometimes we see this as discouraging independence. It's a string on Taiwan. The U.S. is in the middle and very much doesn't like being in the middle. Both Taipei and Beijing wish constantly to manipulate us, and do manipulate our politics, manipulate through lobbying, through legitimate, through illegitimate kinds of means. Our formal position has been characterized, and I like it, as studied ambiguity. We don't want a situation in which Beijing would conclude that the United States would not come to the defense of Taiwan in the event of a military attack. And we do not wish Taiwan to conclude that we would come to their defense in the event of a declaration of independence leading to a military attack. Walking that line satisfies very few.
Would you comment upon most favored nations status?
Let me take a running start at this one because I believe in truth in packaging. That I am not just a neutral analyst on China. That my direct involvement goes back to ping pong in '72. I negotiated the initial exchange agreement in 1978, and I sponsored the first two groups of scholars that came from the PRC in 1978. For a number of years, I headed the U.S.-China relations program, and I oversaw the U.S. one from the National Academy of Sciences. So I've got a stake in this. On normal trade relations, which used to be called most favored nation, except only 5 countries didn't have it. So it's normal. This, of course, benefits China, but it benefits American consumers and companies as well. That whether it is your running shoes or the toys. 75% of the toys in this country come from China. Big tariff on them, they're more expensive. Could we get along without toys? Probably. Kids might have a different story. But normal trade relations is something that common sense says, of course, China should have normal trade relations, because not to have it introduces an element of uncertainty that business doesn't like. That moving up to the June renewal every year forces companies to front-load contracts, that it just makes it harder to have smooth running, efficient business. There's a more immediate reason for doing it now. That my own guess is it's going to happen May or early June at the latest, before the Congress begins to get so fixated on the election campaign that things can't move. But we negotiated with China, it took 14 years, terms of accession to the World Trade Organization, which bring tremendous benefits to the United States. There's a market access. Our markets are open. This opens their markets to us. That doesn't kick in unless China gets normal trade relations. And the permanent normal trade relations is, again, a belated recognition of reality. As a communist country, China got caught in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of 1974, which was written as a condition for the Soviet Union getting most favored nation trade status, and it was written to make it possible for Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. So the formal condition in a communist country has to allow free immigration. When Deng Xiaoping came here in 1979, he said, "How many you want? Million? 10 million? We'll let you, basically Chinese can leave rather. So the formal reason for doing it doesn't exist, even under American law. And it has been used in the linkage to human rights to other things as an annual whipping boy exercise, in part to beat up on China, in part to beat up on the executive branch for its mishandling of China. That has no commercial benefit. And keeping it in place brings no benefits.
How much are we pressing the Japanese to, in effect, pay for the umbrella which you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it's called host nation support. That's the euphemism. We don't like thinking of ourselves as mercenaries or rent an army. But the fact of the matter is, the Japanese pay virtually all of the in-country costs for us to be deployed out there. It costs us more or less the same to have Marines, sailors, Air Force in Japan as it does to have them in Maryland. Because the Japanese put a very, I've forgotten what the figure is, but it's a lot of money. Those are renegotiated episodically. I don't think it's as often as annually. We are coming up to another of them. And one begins to, it's a 5 years, thank you, that the recession that Japan has been in, with the exception of a couple of quarters now for several years, that one begins to hear through the media in Japan, other ways as well, but that might have to cut back on host nation support, might not be able to be as generous. You Americans are in an economic boom. We are in a depression. We are allies, after all. There's a point, but it has not, to my knowledge, yet been addressed at a formal level. And there has not been a reduction in it through the period because it had been agreed to, as you say, 5 years ago.
The first question was, what is the role of the Russians with respect to to Iraq and the oil circumstance. And the hinted second question is, how does Saddam Hussein continue to survive?
Well, you give me a chance to make an important point that I should have in the opening remarks. Russia is not a single entity any more than the United States is a unitary actor. The government of Russia is not smuggling oil out of Iraq. Russians is the incident that you're referring to from the newsflash. A Russian registered tanker owned by a multinational company, partly Russian, partly American, was engaged in smuggling. It wasn't the United States government engaged in smuggling. Individuals were engaged in this activity, and they have a nationality and there's flags on the ships. This is one of, the conversations with the Russians. We didn't do it, we wouldn't do it. Oh no, they're not really our responsibility. I mean, it was sort of that progression. So that is what is true in this example for Russia is true writ large for Russian interaction with Iran, Libya, arms sales to parts of the world. China, there's one China, there's 1.3 billion Chinese, and they don't all do the same thing, and they don't all pay attention to their own country's laws. So you get smuggling, you get violations of the law. And it is a big, big, big mistake that media and too many politicians in this country make to leap on the individual violations and attribute them to responsibility of the national government. Russia's role in Iraq. Russia had a traditionally close relationship with Iraq, sold them a lot of weapons. It's in a general neighborhood of what was the Soviet Union. Iraq is the second largest reserves of oil are in Iraq. It's going to be a major player. The Russians would like to get back in when the embargo is lifted commercially in the oil industry, where they do actually have the ability to compete with multinational companies. Lots of things they can't compete. They can compete for the kinds of contracts they might get in Iraq. So they have been tarred by some as the friend of Saddam. Saddam's mouthpiece in the UN, or the Russians and the French, carrying Saddam's water in the UN, pushing for relaxation of sanctions and so forth. It's enlightened self-interest. They're going to end sometime. If they're perceived as the guys that helped lift them, they might have a better advantage than being perceived as we are, and the British, correctly, as digging in our heels and resisting. There's economic advancement, there's political influence, as well as historic ties. Now, how does Saddam do it? Brutality is part of it. That there are a lot of tough systems out in that part of the world. And the use of violence, intimidation, terror, that it's not Stalinist or Stalinesque in its scope, but it's effective. But there's also the neighbors aren't quite sure what Iraq without Saddam would be. There's a great fear in the region about a breakup of Iraq. Kurds in the north, Shia in the south, Kuwaiti, they would like more of the oil fields on their side. Sunni, Shia splits, water rights. Having Iraq remain intact has a desirability in the eyes of folks in the neighborhood that transcends sort of international law, respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. The other component is at the time the coalition was put together in the Gulf War, amazingly done by President Bush and Secretary Baker, people didn't sign up to oust Saddam. They signed up to drive Iraq out of Kuwait and to deny Saddam the weapons of mass destruction. after the fact that he has hung on for so long has raised lots of, wasn't it foolish? Why didn't we go in and get him at the time? We have this effort, which is misguided in my judgment, to crank up an opposition movement to Saddam. When he is replaced, it's got to be by heartland Iraqis that have decided they've had enough.
Would you comment upon the International Test Ban Treaty? Refer to Pakistan and India, if you would, and comment on our own domestic policy with respect to it.
Here, my administration hat is the same as my personal hat. I think it was a mistake not to have passed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in the Senate. For a lot of reasons. I mean, I think having a control regime, which most people are going to observe, and even if they violate it with some possibility of not getting caught, you're better off than not having the regime. You're better off if you got a regime that forces them to try and hide it. But there are other reasons. I was in Europe. I did a swing through Central Europe 10 years after the fall of the wall. I just wanted to go visit simultaneously places and take stock. And I sure got an earful on defeat of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because it raised questions in their minds about American commitment to the whole range of arms control regimes and policies. It began to look like going it alone, hegemon behavior that was seeping out in ways that went far beyond sort of states affected by it. On India and Pakistan, they may sign this treaty yet. That our ability to persuade them to sign the treaty has clearly been hurt by our failure to ratify it. We have signed it but not ratified it. They have given, each of them have given unilateral commitments not to test, unilateral moratoria not to test. How long that will remain in place? Uncertain. Having them locked into a regime, it raises the threshold against testing. The Pakistanis will not sign the CTBT, I don't believe, until the Indians do. The Indians need to have the right domestic climate to do it, but they've got interests that go far beyond Pakistan and nuclear weapons. They would like a permanent seat on the Security Council, for example. And nations, just like the United States, they use every chip and card that they can play in working issues with us, with the international community. Right now, it's still a bargaining chip.
Unfortunately, again, we've reached the end of the period. I'd like to thank Tom Fingar for an absolutely marvelous presentation. Thank you.